Welcome back to the British Chronicle, your window into Britain's stories, memories, and timeless moments. If you enjoy this journey, hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you'll never miss a new story. Back in the soot-streaked kitchens of working-class Britain in the 1960s, dinner wasn't an event. It was a duty. Not crafted with flair, not romanticized in recipes, but summoned from the scant remains of the pantry with quiet resilience. This was a country still shaking off the dust of post-war rationing, where food remained a negotiation between scarcity and sustenance. Families didn't dine. They filled their bellies with what they could, when they could. Choices weren't laid out on a menu but dictated by the market stall, the butcher's offer of the day, the hidden jars in the larder. Mothers made meals not from abundance but from fragments, a culinary mosaic of scraps that silenced hunger for just one more night. There was no glamour, no sparkle of herbs, no soft clink of wine glasses beside the plate. Instead, there were enamel dishes chipped at the edges, a gas ring whirring like an old kettle, the sharp scent of onions hitting fat, and a child's voice asking, "Is it ready yet, Mom?" Beans on toast was more than a plate. It was a symbol. A tin of Heinz, bought for less than a shilling, stacked high in corner shops like war rations reborn. Opened, heated, and poured over toast browned under a grill, it filled the kitchen with a tang both sharp and sweet. For the millions who ate it, it wasn't poor food. It was survival. It was tradition. It was the silent rhythm of evenings in terraced houses lined shoulder to shoulder like soldiers holding the line. Behind every simple dish was an economic truth. Britain in the 1960s was still straddling the line between empire and austerity. Trade routes had shifted. The imperial safety net had frayed. Imports like Australian corned beef or Argentine beef hash reflected not just convenience but the restructuring of global commerce. Cheap foreign meats arrived not as luxury but as lifelines, filling the vacuum left by a decimated domestic industry. Egg and chips offered another kind of solace. Still affordable, still beloved. The fat hissed in pans across the nation, golden chips crisping, while mothers cracked eggs beside them. Cafes from London to Leeds echoed with that same sound. Enamel mugs steaming, salt shakers crusted white from years of use. Children queued up for it at school. Fathers expected it on Fridays. The smell drifted through rows of terrace houses like a hymn of comfort. In its simplicity, it was dignity preserved on a plate. These meals told stories in silence. A full plate was a mother's victory. A second helping was a rare joy. And leftovers? They were not optional. They were planned. If beans on toast were the anchor of the weekday, then bubble and squeak was its echo. A meal stitched from memory, reheated, reshaped, and remembered in fragments. It was never meant to impress. It was meant to stretch. Sunday's leftovers, boiled cabbage, potatoes, perhaps a lone carrot, pressed into a pan until the edges hissed and crackled, releasing that telltale squeal from which it took its name. This wasn't food for joy, but food for continuity. A bridge between Sundays, a way to ensure that no scrap fell to waste. It filled homes not just with scent, but with the conviction that nothing should be thrown away. Not when wages barely met rent, not when mouths outnumbered coins in the purse. And yet, ask any miner or mill worker, and they'd nod with pride. It tasted better the second time around, especially with an egg on top. In the cold north, where chimneys belched smoke and factory whistles marked the rhythm of life, toad in the hole became almost celebratory, but not because of the sausages. These were not prime pork links. They were bulked with cereal, sometimes so pale and soft they split open in the pan like overripe fruit, but bathed in Yorkshire pudding batter, golden and risen like a crown. Even these humble links seemed noble. It was culinary sleight of hand. 3 sausages became 6 meals. The oven did the magic. Gravy completed the illusion. Food in the 1960s was industrial, much like the landscape, and in many ways meals mirrored machines. Utilitarian, efficient, repurposed. If shepherd's pie was the proud worker, then cottage pie was its quiet twin. Both turned scraps into comfort, lamb or beef buried beneath mashed potato like treasure beneath earth. In homes of 8 or more, a single joint of meat might live 3 lives. Sunday roast, Monday pie, Tuesday soup. These weren't just meals, they were strategies. Invisible algorithms of survival passed from mother to daughter without need for paper or pen. Meat, when it appeared, was often minced, masked in onion, softened by carrots, drenched in brown gravy. It had to be. What the butcher sold was seldom steak. It was filler, fat, and sinew. But heat and patience worked wonders. And as the mash was dolloped on top, creamy or lumpy, depending on the night, there was something ceremonial in its application. A mother smoothing it over like plaster on a cracked wall. A silent promise. This would be enough. And it was. For children who came home from school to that smell wafting down narrow halls. For fathers who returned from long shifts with coal still under their nails. These plates were not crafted by chefs. They were built by necessity, each dish a quiet resistance against hunger, debt, and decline. But as factories began to close and supermarkets began to rise, what happened to these foods built from hardship and hope? Stew with dumplings, in many ways, stood as a monument to British endurance. Heavy, slow-cooked, and thick with purpose, it was the culinary equivalent of a brick wall. It held back the cold, the exhaustion, the hunger that crept in around payday. Made from beef shin, or chuck, whatever the butcher offered cheap, stew welcomed turnips, carrots, swede, barley, whatever was on hand. But it was the dumplings, spongy and steaming, that crowned the meal. Simple balls of flour and suet, dropped into bubbling broth, swelled like little clouds of sustenance. Mothers stirred with wooden spoons worn thin by years of scraping enamel pans. And when the bowls were ladled out, bread was torn, not sliced, and dipped until the last slick of gravy vanished. The windows fogged, the wallpaper yellowed with steam. But bellies were warm, and for that night, at least, life was full. Corned beef hash was a curious paradox. Foreign meat, domestic ritual. Imported from distant Argentina or Australia, the tins lined pantry shelves like wartime relics. The metal key unrolled the lid with a metallic click every child knew by heart. The pink slab inside was no delicacy, but it was adaptable. Fried with onions and potatoes, maybe a leftover carrot, it turned crisp at the edges, fragrant with effort. To some, that tinny taste still triggers nostalgia. To others, it was merely what filled a hole. In towns where jobs were fading, where mines had shut and textile mills grew quiet, this plate was more than dinner. It was a fallback, a guarantee, something that waited in the cupboard when wages did not arrive. Spam fritters sang a similar song. A product of war, a leftover of peace, dipped in batter, fried until golden, they popped in chip shops and school canteens alike. Loved by some, hated by many, they were never forgettable. Crisp on the outside, yielding within. The batter sometimes so hard it could chip a tooth, yet still eaten, still trusted. But in their crunch lay a question. How did we come to rely so deeply on processed imports and preserved meats? How did an empire that once prided itself on pastures and livestock find comfort in cans? If there was ever a dish that embodied contradiction, it was liver and onions. A meal both praised and dreaded, it arrived on the plate with a heavy scent of metal and defiance. Liver was cheap, full of nutrients, and relentless in its flavor. Fried in shallow pans, doused in mountains of sweetened onions, and masked with gravy, it pushed its way onto dinner tables by virtue of cost. Ministry pamphlets, school canteens, and wartime dietitians all swore by its value. It was iron-rich, good for blood and bone, but the children who faced it each week often held their forks in silent rebellion. The smell lingered in curtains. The taste clung to memory. Yet in homes where choices were few, it was unignorable. Tripe followed similar lines. A dish from another time, it appeared like a ghost of Britain's culinary past. Sold in slabs at the market, boiled until limp and swallowed with onions or milk, it was divisive in every sense. To fathers, it recalled pre-war suppers. To children, it was punishment. But still, it was there, week after week. And when the shelves offered almost nothing else, bread and dripping stepped in. Made from the hardened fat of a Sunday roast, saved in a bar and spread thick across bread. It was salt and sustenance. No elegance, no apology, just calories wrapped in memory. Children took it to school. Parents ate it cold. In kitchens without fridges, it was both spread and story. Then there was bread and cheese. No garnish, no pickle unless lucky. Just a block of cheddar, chipped away to last, laid on thick white slices with a cup of tea to wash it down. This wasn't a plowman's lunch of pub menus. It was desperation dressed as dinner. Yet in those moments, it provided what mattered most: fuel and a quiet moment. These meals, layered in thrift and necessity, were not just responses to hunger. They were reactions to a world changing too fast for wages to catch up. Britain in the 1960s was entering a new phase, factories becoming office blocks, coal towns turning silent, and kitchens replacing hearths with freezers. And in that evolution, the meals that once carried the nation began to fade from sight. What happens when a culture built on making do forgets how to make do at all? There was a strange dignity in the scarcity, a kind of wisdom handed down not through words but through action, through the press of a fork, the way leftovers were folded into something new. Meals like shepherd's pie and cauliflower cheese carried more than flavor. They held memory, heritage. Cauliflower cheese was humble, yet rich with symbolism. A whole vegetable bought for pennies, bathed in a thick, often improvised cheese sauce, sometimes real cheddar, other times powdered mix from a packet. It was baked until the top turned golden and bubbled, sending a scent down the hallway that made children forget there was no meat. Served with bread for mopping, it was one of the few vegetarian plates that felt like indulgence, even when it wasn't. And then came kippers, salted, smoked, their oily perfume leaking into every corner of the house. For seaside towns, it was standard. For inland families, it was a compromise. Cheap, rich in protein, and unmistakable. Children wrinkled their noses. Fathers swore it gave them strength. But it was a breakfast that filled a lunchbox, a dinner that warmed through cold bones. Bone broth soup and peas pudding tell us more about the values of that era than any political slogan. Bone broth began with what the butcher gave away, bones still clinging to scraps of meat. Mothers boiled them for hours, clouds of steam frosting the windows. With barley and root veg, the broth became thick, nourishing. It wasn't stew, and it wasn't glamorous, but it was warm, and it lasted. Peas pudding, yellow and dense, was born from the same spirit. Boiled split peas, sometimes blended with ham scraps if they could be found, were mashed into a spread. Served cold or warm, on bread or as part of tea. It was food without fuss. Food that asked nothing but to fill a space. These meals, forgotten by supermarket aisles, were once the scaffolding of the British working-class table. They carried no pride in taste, but immense pride in resilience. Every tin of Spam, every jar of dripping was a mark of endurance. They were not about cuisine. They were about continuity. So what do we lose when such meals disappear? Is it just the recipe, or is it the entire culture that cooked without waste, lived without excess, and still found comfort in what little they had? Today, the echoes of those kitchens grow fainter. Terrace streets now boast fitted appliances and induction hobs. The scent of boiled cabbage no longer clings to coats hung behind doors. Yet somewhere between the convenience of ready meals and the abundance of global choice, something essential was quietly set down. In those plates, once deemed humble or bleak, lay the most honest reflection of a people, stubborn, resourceful, communal. Food was not an identity or an aesthetic. It was a gesture of care, a testament to thrift, a rebellion against waste. In places where hardship sat beside every family photo, the evening meal still found a way to gather everyone round. Even now, nostalgia drifts back with the steam of remembered suppers. A slice of bread with dripping, the thick gravy pooled in enamel, the hiss of sausages splitting in a battered pan. These sounds and smells were more than memory. They were ritual, community, continuity. We marvel today at sustainability, at zero waste, at nose-to-tail dining. But these were not innovations in 1960s Britain. They were simply what had to be done. And in doing so, a generation forged a culture of resilience so potent, it still lives in the quiet pride of those who remember. Perhaps, in looking back, we might also look forward differently. Might we rediscover not just recipes, but the values embedded within them? Might we honor those who fed many with little, and ask ourselves, how can we learn from what was never intended to last? Because in those vanished kitchens, surrounded by steam and soot, something powerful was built. A legacy of making do, of feeding with dignity, of surviving together. But is that truly all that remains? A handful of recipes and a few fading memories? Or might we dare to ask, but is that really the whole story?